teaching today is on the Holy Christian Imagination. And at the heart of the teaching is this truth, that Jesus redeems our imagination for beauty and for devotion to Him. There's so little teaching in Christendom about the imagination. And so much of sexual brokenness and general brokenness is that our minds are filled with images that are perverted, or images that are broken, or images that are dark. Or our minds are missing images of beauty. And we have no internal resources to pull upon when darkness comes our way. And also, in devotion to the Lord, we can use our imagination to worship Him and to create works of art that give glory to Him. The great writers, Bach, for example, he always put in his manuscripts, "To God be the glory." And he was writing to God's glory, and the music he made was for God's glory. And so many of the great artists, like Leonardo da Vinci, he was painting to the glory of God. And in his works, he was trying to communicate something of God's reality to our natural world. So the imagination then enables us to use our faith to apprehend the unseen realities and the meaning of God's creation. That's the imagination when it is used at its best. St. Paul, when he writes to the Corinthians, exhorts them to exercise their holy Christian imagination by fixing their eyes on the unseen real. He does this also in writing to the Hebrews. Let's look first at the verse that to the Hebrews, Hebrews 11:1. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. To be certain of what you do not see is to apprehend it in some way, and the imagination enables that. 2 Corinthians 4:18. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. How is it that we fix our eyes on that which is unseen? The word eyes there cannot mean physical eyes. It must mean spiritual eyes. That we are to apprehend reality with the imagination, with the eyes of the heart. So faith then is believing in things that are unseen, but it is not believing in things that have no existence in God's reality. God doesn't ask us to believe in Santa Claus. God doesn't ask us to believe in UFOs. These are things that are not real. God asks us to believe in the supernatural, like angels, yes, demons, unfortunately. So the Lord asks us to hitch our faith to that which is unseen and use our imagination to apprehend that. So seeing the unseen real is central to a truly Christian worldview, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. Now, faith utilizes the soul's capacity to imagine. So much faith has to do with being able to create a picture in your mind on the testimony of someone else. And as you do that, your faith grows. Let me give you an example that I received from reading Joseph Pieper's work on faith. Let's say it's at the turn of the 19th and the 20th century. Back then, it was widely understood that pollen were little circular dark things that landed on your clothes and things like that. But then suddenly, the microscope was invented. But there weren't many of them, and they put pollen under a microscope. And those who had access to a microscope could see that pollen was not round at all. Pollen is square. Pollen is in little angular geometric shapes and has no curves. Now, if I reported to you as a person in authority, I've been looking at pollen under this new invention called the microscope, and I described to you that it's not round but really geometric shapes, and you take that leap in your mind, pollen is not round, even though that's what I see, but the reality that I cannot see is that it's square. And if I put my faith and trust in the authority of the witness, the person who saw it, then I actually have attached my faith and my belief to a reality I do not see, and it is my imagination that allows me to attach my faith to it. And in putting my faith toward that reality and toward the fact that pollen is more geometric than round, I am more in touch with reality itself. I am more in touch with what God has created, even though I cannot see it. So much faith has to do with someone who can communicate the faith, whom you trust, and who can paint pictures for you that cause your faith to grow. That's why a testimony is so powerful. You don't have to have the experience of the person who gives the testimony if you trust the person who's giving the testimony. That's why the scriptures are reliable. Everyone who penned one of the books in the New Testament had contact with Jesus. They saw him. The witness is reliable. And it is as we read those words that God gave them to write, those inspired words, that pictures of reality are formed in our heart. And as we give our faith to that reality, we are more in touch with what God has truly made. And imagination then leads us to reality. In our brokenness, however, imagination leads us away from reality into fantasy. Now, good fantasy has a way of teaching us about reality. Like C.S. Lewis's work, the space trilogy, Perelandra and Out of the Silent Planet, and That Hideous Strength. Or his fantasy work for children, The Chronicles of Narnia, where the central character is Aslan. Both those stories have elements of fantasy in them, but they are fantasies that are created within the Christian worldview, and they lead us into reality, into the realities of the faith, into the realities of the struggle between good and evil. But there are some fantasies that don't lead us into reality, but are departures from reality. And I don't think those are very good for the soul, even though they might make interesting reading. Now, the imagination, says many people, is part of the image of God in us, and it helps us to grasp meaning itself. Cheryl Forbes, in her book Imagination, Embracing a Theology of Wonder, she says that the imagination helps us to know God, to receive his grace, to worship him, to see life through his eyes. And C.S. Lewis calls the imagination the organ of meaning. Now, as God's creatures, our ability to imagine is related to language, to symbol, and to communion with God himself. And let me unpack that for you. We are creatures who symbolize. We symbolize because we are creatures who have a language. The other creatures of this world do not. That's one of the reasons they're not made in the image of God. But words are symbols. They point to something else. The word apple that you hear coming out of my mouth right now is not the same thing as those letters, A-P-P-L-E. And both those letters that you read and the sounds that you hear are pointing to another reality. That reality is that juicy red thing or that juicy green thing you bite into. And so every time we are talking, we are symbolizing. We are pointing to something else, and your mind is always at work imaginatively connecting the words to the picture, to the reality. We are symbolizing. We are constantly symbolizing. Dreams do this as well. Now, not all dreams are from the Lord, but in the scriptures, you repeatedly read accounts of people who've had dreams that have been sent by the Lord. And so sometimes the Lord can speak to us through our dreams. But many of us are out of touch with that, or we fear that. Now, you can have a bad dream because you ate spicy food, and you have a dream of a house burning down, and really your stomach is just upset. And you can have a bad dream because you saw a scary film. But you can have a bad dream because something bad is going on in your life, and you are trying to sort that out on your bed as you're sleeping. And the Lord can use that to speak to you and give you direction. There are such things as dreams that God sends to give us direction. But we don't receive those dreams once a week. I dare say we received those dreams maybe a handful of times during our lifespan. I received one such dream in my early 30s when I was a time in crisis, and that dream actually allowed me to make a major transition. I gave up a career as a university professor in drama and went and studied at seminary. And I was looking for direction, and I was asking God to speak to me, and He used a dream to help me go in that direction. Now, I did not make my decision to go to seminary exclusively on that one dream. That would have been foolishness. But I was seeking the Lord, and that dream did bring confirmation. And as the Joseph and Daniel cycles in the Old Testament confirm, God alone holds the interpretation to dreams. So when we have a dream, we need to ask the Lord, is this from you? And if it is from you, what does it mean? But your heart will have generated the symbols and the pictures in that dream, and so it may be your heart speaking to you, which you need to listen to. Now, as fallen creatures, our capacity to symbolize needs to be redeemed from the mire of vain and delusional visions and diseased fantasy lives. In the King James Version, in Ezekiel 12:24, there is this command, there shall be no more vain vision nor flattering divination within the house of Israel. That's important to understand, that the imagination can be hitched to your vanity, can be hitched to your narcissistic impulses for grandiosity. And this is why our imagination must always be used in harmony with reality and with what God has created. At the same time, if we have fed our imagination perverted images, or if we have fed our imagination images that are not rooted in reality, our imagination can actually be polluted, such as with diseased sexual fantasy lives, which I have to deal with a lot. In my own life I had to deal with, and I have to be careful that sexual images don't creep into my heart that are unhealthy. And when they do creep in, either from television or from movies or from billboards or from scantily dressed people on the street, and they visit me at night, I have to ask the Lord for the strength to get those out of my mind. But the reality is, you can get those out of your mind. Sometimes those images link with our sinful nature and lust enters in. Then you not only have to get the image out of your mind, you have to confess the lust that has entered in on the heels of those images. There are many men and women who repress their imagination for fear of what is there. And friends, if there is something in your heart that does not belong there, you need to let it come up and out of you into the presence of the Lord. Those who have been sexually abused, for example, the image of that sexual abuse is so traumatic that oftentimes it has an invasive quality into the person's life, and it tends to come at them at the most inopportune times. In fact, most abuse victims don't have difficulty remembering the abuse. They have difficulty getting it out of their mind. So they can sometimes use their mind to repress their imagination so the image does not revisit them. But unfortunately, that can cause the entire imagination to shut down. But it won't shut down permanently. It will come out in another way. But the Lord can enter into abusive memories and not change the fact of what happened, but change the effect of what happened. We'll actually talk about that in our next lecture on applying forgiveness, so I won't go there now. But the point I'm making is that we need to get those images up and out of ourselves and lay them before the cross of Christ and let Him transform them. So we are to devote our imagination to God and let it be used in harmony with reality. So it is through devotion to the Lord and then using the imagination in harmony with reality that our imagination is actually redeemed and then actually can be used of God to give us direction. The Brown Drivers Briggs version of the Hebrew English lexicon, it talks about the word imagination in the Hebrew, which is the word yetzer. It means what is framed in the mind. So when Isaiah 26:3 is translated, "Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee," the word mind is actually the word yetzer. And in the RSV text note there, it says this could also be translated, "Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose imagination is stayed on thee. One of my favorite devotional writers is Oswald Chambers. And I have to say, I return to him time and time again. Before I read the scriptures, I will read the entry that he has for the day, and it will prepare my heart to encounter the Holy Scriptures. His February 10th and 11th entries are on the use of the imagination. And this is what he writes. One of the reasons of stultification in prayer is that there is no imagination, no power of putting ourselves deliberately before God. Imagination is the power God gives a saint to posit himself out of himself into relationships he never was in. Imagination is the greatest gift God has given us, and it ought to be devoted entirely to Him. Learn to associate ideas worthy of God with all that happens in nature, the sunrises and the sunsets, the sun and the stars, the changing seasons, and your imagination will never be at the mercy of your impulses, but will always be at the service of God. Recently, I was sitting on my porch with my daughter, and it's summertime, and the fireflies are out. And I said to her, why do you think God made the fireflies? And she gave it a thought. She says, what do you think, Daddy? And I said, I think it's God's way of saying, I love you. And she said, I think it's God's way of saying, I love you and have a good night. And I thought, that is so adorable. But I think she's very close to the meaning of why a firefly lights up. It's to bless us. It is to say, have a good night. And so Nancy and I are actively trying to help our children view creation through the eyes of the Creator. And that beauty in creation has meaning. It's not just the result of some accidental chain of events. So the imagination then, when it is rightly attached to God, leads us to hope, leads us to see beauty. Leland Ryken, in his book, The Liberated Imagination, he writes this: the imagination has its unique way of expressing truth and reality. At the level of human issues, works of art are a window to reality, like a lens that distorts in order to enable us to see something more clearly. The artistic imagination creates ordinary worlds that allow us to see reality with heightened clarity. Isn't that beautiful? He's a professor at Wheaton College. Now, the truly imaginative experiences are apprehensions of reality. And these levels of reality, or these realms of reality, in the scriptures and throughout Christian philosophy and theology, have been divided into three realms: nature, supernature, and the divine. I think probably the best book that talks about this is C.S. Lewis's 1960 book, Miracles. And here he shows how Christian philosophy identified these three realms of reality, and then goes on to show how Jesus and Christian believers participate in these three realms of reality. For example, the natural world. The scriptures talks about the natural world in Genesis 1. God created. And there is a detailed explanation on everything from water to the earth to creatures to human beings came into being in this natural world. And it's beautiful and it's poetic. Then Ephesians 3:10 talks about the rulers and authorities in heavenly realms. And here we are going from the level of nature to the level of supernature, to the heavenly realms. Particularly, we're talking about angels and demons at that point. 1 Timothy 6:16 talks about the God who lives in unapproachable light. God, the blessed and only ruler, the King of kings and Lord of lords, who alone is immortal and who lives in unapproachable light, whom no one has seen or can see. This is the level of the divine. Now, Jesus, being fully God and fully man, participates in all three realms of reality, and consequently, so do we. He takes on our bodies, so the divine takes on the natural. He's God in a bod, as one of my theology professors used to say. And I love that. I think that's just a wonderful way, is that in the body, Jesus participates in nature. In our body, we participate in nature. And then in our spirits, like we have a spirit, we participate in supernature. And through the indwelling presence of the Holy Spirit in us, we participate in the divine. That is clearly taught in 2 Peter 1:3 and 4 in the New King James Version, where it talks about that. I'll just read the whole quote. Not all of it will appear. For those of you who are watching the video, it talks about His divine power has given to us all things that pertain to life and godliness through the knowledge of Him who called us by glory and virtue, by which have been given to us exceedingly great and precious promises. And here's the part, that through these you may be partakers of the divine nature. So we partake of the divine nature, having escaped corruption that is in the world through lust. That's the end of the scriptures. Now, it's very important that when we talk about partaking of the divine nature, we are not talking about monism, this sort of touchy-feely, benevolent, divine vibration that's in the universe, that's in the trees, that's in us, and that God's presence is everywhere. God's presence is